Greetings, this is Greg. Welcome to part 5 of my P-47 series. In this episode, we're going to explore the P-47's maneuverability, including maximum and sustained turn performance. For you metric folks, I'll include your units of measurement, either verbally or on screen, to the maximum extent possible. This is going to be a fairly numbers-heavy episode, so I can't promise that every chart I'm going to completely convert to metric, but I'll have enough on there so you'll get the gist of things. Now, few would call the P-47 a highly maneuverable fighter, but the truth is that at high speed, and especially at high altitude, it's quite agile as compared with other fighters, but at low speeds, and especially at low altitudes, it is generally at a disadvantage in terms of turn rates, maximum sustained climb rates, climb angles, and some other factors. Now let's start by taking a look at the basic U.S. Army Air Force maneuvers that were taught to all U.S. fighter pilots in World War II. During advanced training, new pilots usually flew the AT-6 Texan. AT stands for Advanced Trainer. This plane is about as near to a fighter as pilots could get without actually being in a fighter plane. Now there were some armed variants of the AT-6, but normally it was just a trainer, and normally it was unarmed. They would fly this plane and master all the basic aerobatic maneuvers a fighter pilot would need before moving on to P-40s, P-47s, or whatever. These maneuvers are described in the Advanced Single-Engine Flying Instructor's Manual. The point of learning aerobatics was largely to gain mastery of the aircraft, not because the U.S. Army Air Force thought that aerobatics would win dogfights. In fact, this manual says that aerobatics are, quote, useless for trying to escape a well-lodged enemy, unquote. It goes on to say that the best answer is to make a maximum performance turn, and also cautions against reversing the turn. This isn't a video on tactics, but entering a maximum performance turn may or may not be the right solution. If the enemy's plane has superior turn performance, he will eventually get his sights on you unless outside factors intervene. Thus, staying in a one-direction maximum performance turn isn't always going to work out well, and that is mentioned in the manual in other places. Before we move on, I'll mention that in Fundamentals of Air Fighting, another World War II USAAF publication, they mention surprise as being a very important factor, and also caution against reversing turns. USAAF pilots would learn essentially the same maneuvers taught to military pilots all over the world. These included loops, the split S, which is really just the second half of a loop started from level flight by rolling inverted, the Immelman, which is the first half of a loop with a 180-degree roll at the top to get upright, barrel rolls, aileron rolls, including slow aileron rolls that is, the chandelle, which is a maximum performance climb with a 180-degree turn. The chandelle is a particularly useful maneuver in fighter planes, and it's not mentioned too often. And of course we have stalls and spins. Now if you don't remember stalls or spins from earlier episodes, let's have a super quick and dirty review. A stall has nothing to do with the engine. It's a condition created when the wing exceeds its maximum angle of attack, which results in hugely reduced lift and increased drag. Thus, when the wing stalls, and this usually happens at low indicated airspeeds, the plane falls out of the sky. It's important to understand that even at high speeds and at any pitch attitude, even pointing straight down, any speed, any attitude, it's possible to stall the wing. This is usually done by pulling back really hard on the stick. Now, if, while stalled, sufficient yawing force is added, typically that's because the pilot puts in a lot of rudder input. It could also be by other factors, including differential thrust if you have two engines out there. But if this happens, the plane will enter into a spin, in which case it will fall towards the Earth as it rotates. Both stall and spin avoidance and recovery were taught to and mastered by pilots before they got this far along in their flight training. In fact, stall avoidance and recovery is usually learned within about the first 10 hours of flight training. The rest of the Advanced Single-Engine Training Manual goes over things like attack profiles and overall considerations for combat. I'm not going to cover those things in this video. I am toying with the idea of having maybe a John Boyd video about him and going over tactics, but it'll be another day. So that brings us to the P-47. Since we will be covering all the Thunderbolt variants to an extent, a quick review of them is in order. This is not complete, but should give you the basic idea of the various types of Thunderbolts. The P-47B, as in Bravo, was the first model to see service. It's a 2,000 horsepower airplane. The next model is the C, as in Charlie, which for our purposes is the same thing as the B model. It does have some minor improvements, but it's the same airplane in terms of performance. The D, as in Delta model, was by far the most produced. Now these have numerous improvements and usually more performance due to increased horsepower and improved propellers. Most of the D models have water methanol injection and either 2,300 or 2,600 horsepower, depending on the subtype. Now there are also G, as in Golf models, which are Thunderbolts built by Curtiss. This is a bit confusing. It depends on when they were built. A G model could be a clone of either a C model, a Republic C model, or it could be a clone of a D model. So when somebody says it's a P-47G, as in Golf, that pretty much covers the whole spectrum of P-47s. That could be anything. Now, the final model, which was used in the European theater, was the P-47M, as in Mike. This was a lightened and powerful model, 2,800 horsepower. Top speed of 473 miles an hour, and is generally considered the fastest P-47 variant. The last model was the P-47N, as in November. This was hugely improved. It had tail warning radar, increased range, new wings. It could do 465 miles per hour, and I should point out that while the M is officially the fastest model, M as in Mike, it was tested at a lower weight. At equal weights, I'm not sure an M would outrun a November. In fact, I kind of think it won't. Now, let's start with the flight manual for a later D model with a bubble top canopy to see what maneuvers the 47 can and cannot do. Starting from the top, no intentional spins of more than half a turn. Many World War II fighters can't do spins at all, so that's a plus for the P-47, but some fighters can do 4 or 5 turns or more. This isn't really a disadvantage for the P-47, the fact that it can't do more than half a turn, because a plane in a spin is a sitting duck. It's not a useful maneuver in combat. What is useful is knowing that you can push the plane to the edge, and worst case, if you spin it, you can recover provided you have the altitude. So the ability to enter and recover from a spin is a plus for the P-47. Next, no outside loops. This is because the negative g-forces over the time it would take to complete the maneuver. Okay, this is separate from suddenly shoving the nose down in a dive and worrying about the engine will cut out. That's not something that would happen in the P-47, but the extended time that you're going to expose the airplane to negative g's in an outside loop will starve the engine of fuel and oil. I don't know of a single World War II fighter that could perform an outside loop. It would not serve any practical purpose, and the weight and space the needed equipment would take up are better used for other things like guns and ammunition. Moving on, whip stalls. I don't know of any World War II fighter that can do this. Maybe the Zero can do it, maybe the Oscar. In any case, it's not really a useful combat maneuver. A whip stall is sort of like a tail slide. It involves a vertical or near vertical climb with a stall at the end, and then as the plane slides backwards, it experiences a very violent nose-down motion. Maybe you could watch. I just Google it. I'm sure some airshow pilots have videos of it. Next, prolonged inverted flight. Well, you can't do this for the same reason you can't do an outside loop. Again, limitation for every World War II fighter I know of. No snap rolls. Okay, this one is unusual for a World War II fighter. Most fighters that can do spins can also do snap rolls. The odd thing is that the earlier P-47 variants were approved for snap rolls, provided they were entered at or below 150 miles per hour. However, with the D-25 and later models, they are prohibited. If you don't remember, a snap roll is actually the same thing as a spin, but entered at a higher speed and in a more horizontal plane. You get into it by pulling the stick back suddenly to induce a stall and giving it full rudder. If you don't recover, it ends up becoming a normal spin. Snap rolls are not normally useful as a maneuver in combat. However, there are some cases when rolling and slowing down simultaneously and quickly are helpful, and the snap roll does both of those things. So not being able to do that might inconvenience a late model Thunderbolt pilot at some point. No slow rolls above 313 miles an hour. Yeah, that doesn't really matter. In combat, you don't want to roll slowly, and I don't see this as being a problem. I think the reasoning here, though, is that during a slow roll, errors tend to cause the plane to pitch down, especially as it nears 90 degrees of bank. In the P-47, that causes speed to build up really fast, and that can be dangerous if you start the maneuver at a high speed. The combination of downward pitch, high bank angle, high speed might require a lot of altitude to recover, and you might exceed the dive speed limits. I find that in the few civilian aerobatic planes I've flown, you actually have the opposite issue. If you don't enter with enough speed, you can't complete the maneuver, but with the P-47, the problem is you don't want to enter with too much speed. Number 7 doesn't really matter. You shouldn't be doing these things with external stores. What surprises me is that there are not more prohibitions with external tanks mounted. Last, we have cowl flap limitations. It's not really a maneuvering limitation, but it's here, so we'll cover it. When above 225 miles per hour, they need to be closed to avoid tail buffeting. So other than these prohibited maneuvers, the P-47 is a highly aerobatic airplane. It can perform essentially any type of maneuver needed in combat, so that's good. But the question becomes, how well can the P-47 maneuver as compared with other fighters? Before we get to that, I want to point out what I think is an interesting fun fact. Some manuals, specifically certain later P-47 manuals, give instructions on various aerobatic maneuvers. Most World War II manuals do not. As an example, this page from the manual for a late D model, one up to and including the D-25, gives us instructions for an Immelmann. As you can see, you need a minimum speed of 350 miles per hour to start this maneuver. Side note, I'll be quick about this one, I don't think Max Immelmann himself ever did an Immelmann in the Fokker-Eindecker. I think he did something a little bit more like a wingover with a rollout and level at the top. I don't believe the Eindecker could legitimately do an Immelmann, but that's just my opinion based on my experience in underpowered airplanes. Now, regarding that 350 mile an hour entry speed for the P-47, that's 350 miles an hour indicated, and that's a lot. That's it's equal to the top speed of the airplane at sea level, or very close. Thus, to do an Immelmann in a P-47, you may need to build up some speed in a dive first, depending on your altitude. If you end up inverted below 130 miles an hour, it's a problem, and you won't be able to roll level. Now, if we had data like this for every airplane and every maneuver, that would make comparing maneuverability of all World War II fighters a bit easier. Sadly, this sort of data was only included in the flight manuals for a few airplanes. As an example, I'll put up this page from the LA-5 manual. This plane can start the Immelmann at 311 miles per hour. That means if a P-47 was following and both planes were doing 320 miles per hour initially, the LA-5 could pull into an Immelmann and the 47 couldn't. The 47 pilot would probably have to perform a different maneuver to try and follow. In this case, probably a chandelle, which would put the 47 behind and above the LA-5, although at a slower speed. Of course, the 47 pilot might be better off electing not to follow at all. A lot would depend on the altitude of the engagement. We also need to consider that the speeds in the flight manuals don't specify weights. In the case of the LA-5, it doesn't really matter, as its weight doesn't vary that much with its fuel load, because it doesn't carry that much. Thus, its 311 mile per hour entry speed is going to be very close to the true minimum speed all the time. In the case of the 47, that 350 mile an hour speed is probably for a plane with full internal fuel and ammo, and would be quite a bit lower after it burns off 100 gallons or so of internal fuel. Thus, while it's never going to be as low as the LA-5, not as bad as it looks for the Thunderbolt. Also, I should mention those speeds are going to vary a bit due to pilot skill, and they're probably assuming a worst-case scenario when they publish those speeds. Now, let's look at maximum performance horizontal turns and move on from there. For this, we're going to be using Aerodynamics for Naval Aviators, which for the rest of this video I'll call the book. I covered these principles before in my video on P-51 turn performance, which I'll link in the description. I'll also link a download for the book. It's free. In any aircraft, maximum turn performance takes place at the lowest speed at which the plane is capable of reaching its G limit. The U.S. Navy calls this maneuver speed, which is not to be confused with maneuvering speed used in other areas of aviation. So the first thing we need to do is determine our maximum G limit. G-force is often called load factor. I'll use those terms interchangeably. In many aircraft, the maximum load factor is a hard number and it's published. However, as with many World War II fighters, no such number is published for the P-47, likely because the structural G limit of the plane is way beyond the point where the pilot would pass out. The point where the pilot passes out is also a bit tough to pin down. In several documents of the U.S. Army Air Force, they say that maximum continuous amount of G-force a pilot can withstand without blacking out is 4 Gs. However, we're not trying to figure out the maximum continuous turn performance just yet. We will do that later in the video. Right now, we just want the maximum turn performance, period. I'm going to use 7 Gs for this, and the reason is that's an amount that a typical fighter pilot can withstand without a G-suit. A G-suit would add about 1 more G. There are certain airshow pilots that can pull more. As an extreme example, the Red Bull air race pilots pull 10 Gs and do it over and over during the race. So I think 7 Gs is a reasonable number to use, but if you want to recalculate using another number, you'll be able to. I'll show you how. The next number we need is the aircraft's stall speed. Every P-47 manual publishes the same flaps up, gear up stall speed number. It's 115 miles per hour indicated airspeed. However, there's a minor problem with using that number. First of all, as I'll be doing comparisons with other airplanes, I have to use calibrated, not indicated airspeed numbers. We don't have calibration data for that speed, but based on the trend, I would say it's probably about dead on at 115 miles per hour. Can't say for sure. Next, we have to think about the weight of the airplane. Nowhere in the pilot manual does it say the weight that's associated with that published stall speed. I suspect it's for a fairly high weight, but what if it's for an average weight? To see where I'm going with this, take a look at the weight and balance chart for an earlier P-47D, and you can see that the weight varies from 12,500 up to 15,000 pounds. That variation alone will cause about a 10 mile per hour difference in stall speed. That 12,500 number doesn't even factor in any fuel burned out of the main tank or ammo that's been expended. It's quite possible to be fighting in a P-47 that's down around 11,600 pounds. It's also possible your P-47 is heavier. Bubble top versions weigh an extra 560 pounds, and the manual says that the stall speed is higher, but then later on prints the exact same 115 mile per hour stall speed. So since I don't want to risk calculating based on numbers that are too low, I figured the 115 number was for an early D model at 12,500 pounds. I simply added the weight for a bubble top, and that brings us right up to 118 miles per hour. Adjusting stall speeds for weight is easy math we've covered before. Speaking of easy math, I'm rounding that stall speed to 120 miles per hour for these examples, which is still a realistic number for a combat-ready P-47. In short, I'm assuming the 115 mile per hour stall speed is for an early D model with a normal combat load. I think that's reasonable. And I'm bumping the speed up for the bubble top via math from the book. Speaking of the book, we need to get back in there to figure out our maneuver speed. The math on this is easy. We take the square root of our maximum load factor. in this case 7 Gs, and multiply it by our stall speed of 120 miles per hour, and we get 318 miles per hour, or 512 kilometers per hour. Of course, we need to put it into knots so we can use it on the chart from the book, and we get 276 knots. I'll graph that on the chart. We're looking at the red lines right now. Pay no attention to the other colored lines. I'll talk about other lines here later. This chart assumes a constant altitude level turn. So instead of plotting g-forces, it uses bank angles. Not a problem for us. We pull out our g-forces versus bank angle chart and see that we need to plot using 82 degrees of bank. I double checked this and all the other numbers with an electronic calculator for accuracy. Now, back to our turn performance chart. Let's zoom in on the bottom section. From the bottom at 276 knots, I draw the line up. From there, I draw a horizontal line that intersects the first line at the 82 degree mark. Then we go over to the right to read turn radius. We get 940 feet. I double checked this with the calculator, and the more correct answer is 960 feet. Looks like my red line is closer to 83 degrees of bank than 82, so my Microsoft Paint skills need some work, but I think you get the idea of how this works. So our minimum turn radius in a P-47, based on a 120 mile per hour stall speed, like I say, that's on the high side of the range, and a 7G limit, is about 960 feet. Well, what about turn rate? Let's go to the top of the chart and take a look. Here we get a little better than 27 degrees per second, 27.7 via the electronic calculator. Let's talk a bit more about load factor and how it relates to accelerated stalls. An accelerated stall is just a stall that occurs at a higher than normal speed due to load factor. The stall speed increases as the square root of the load factor. Thus, at 4 Gs, your stall speed doubles because the square root of 4 is 2. Thus, with 120 mile per hour stall speed at 4 Gs, you will stall at 240 miles per hour. When you stall at a higher speed like this, due to an increased load factor, that's an accelerated stall. This will be an important concept as we move forward. Now, we calculated the maximum turn performance numbers in a horizontal turn because that's the way we have to do it with the Navy's chart. However, the limitations would be the same in the vertical or in climbing or descending turns. That means we would still need 318 miles per hour to pull the same 7 Gs no matter what the plane is that we're turning in. There are, however, some differences to keep in mind when operating outside of the horizontal. A big variable is the effect of gravity on speed. Obviously, when going uphill, the plane will have a much harder time maintaining speed. Thus, the pilot will have to reduce the G-load at a greater rate than he would in the horizontal, and vice versa for a descent. Another factor is the asymmetrical thrust from the propeller. There are 4 forces or turning tendencies that cause this. The first 3 are spiraling slipstream, torque, and gyroscopic precession. Today, we're not too concerned with those. However, we are concerned with the fourth one, which is called P factor. This is an important issue to understand, so I'll go over it. At high angles of attack, which normally means at low speeds, but it could be at higher speeds when at high G-loads, the propeller provides asymmetrical thrust because the descending blade takes a larger bite of air than the ascending blade. Now I'm going to explain this. So suppose for a moment that this helicopter is hovering with 0 forward airspeed. Pay no attention to the words in this image. I just grabbed it off Wikimedia Commons because it's public domain, but it was made for another purpose. At this moment, the rotor blades are equally loaded and the lift from the 2 blades are equal. Now, imagine this helicopter moving forward towards the top of your screen at 100 miles per hour. How does that affect the airspeed of the rotor blades? Well, it increases the airspeed of the forward-moving blade by 100 miles per hour when it's at the 3 o'clock position, but decreases the retreating blade speed by the same amount. Thus, the blade on the right side, the one that's moving forward, is getting a much bigger bite of air. I think that's easy to visualize with this picture. Note, our scenario assumes equal blade pitch on each side, and that is not realistic for a helicopter, but that doesn't matter for our discussion. We're not really talking about helicopters here. Now, imagine we have the ability to tilt the rotors all the way forward, which we do in an Osprey. Once the rotors are perpendicular to the relative wind, this asymmetrical loading goes away. But what about when the Osprey is moving forward with the blades in a mid-range tilt? Now it has asymmetrical loading again, because now the downward moving blade has a forward moving component. At this point, you should be able to see why at high angles of attack, a propeller airplane has greater thrust from the descending blade. From there, it's pretty easy to mentally fill in the blanks. If at a negative angle of attack, the ascending blade will have a bigger bite. Now let's say your angle of attack is 0, but the plane is in a slip to the right. In this case, the blade moving to the right has the biggest bite, causing a pitching force instead of a yawing force. Thus, P-factor can pull the plane in any direction, depending on the relative wind, but it is normally thought of as a yawing force to the left. That's because in an engine that rotates clockwise as viewed from the cockpit, from behind the engine, as with the P-47, at high angles of attack, the downward moving propeller blades will generate more force than the upward moving blades and cause the plane to yaw to the left. Thus, the higher the power, the greater the angle of attack, the harder it's going to yaw to the left. That means as the plane approaches the stall speed and angle of attack is high, the force is also high. Also at low speeds, the control surfaces start to become less effective. This is one of the reasons P-factor is taught as a left-turning tendency. It's the most significant at low speeds and high power. Maybe a right-turning tendency in a dive at 400 miles per hour, but who cares? You'll have plenty of control authority in that situation anyway. In the P-47 at low speeds and high power, it's actually possible to have the P-factor overpower the rudder. In this statement from NACA, they make it clear that it's possible to run out of rudder travel before the stall. That's probably part of the reason P-47s had a fair amount of accidents in the takeoff and aborted landing phases of flight. Back to P-factor. So it causes a left-turning tendency at high angles of attack, but a right-turning tendency at negative angles of attack. In a side slip, it pulls the nose up or down, depending on which way you're slipping. All propeller airplanes exhibit P-factor in the same way, at least to some degree. Some planes have props that rotate in the other direction, in which case they pull to the right at high angles of attack. But all have the same issue. Now, normally it's not a big deal. As a pilot, you get used to it pretty fast and compensate with the flight controls without really thinking about it. However, based on NACA reports, I think in the 47 it was a much bigger deal than usual, partially because it had such a powerful big engine, big propeller, but also because of the lack of flight controls, or lack of flight control authority, I should say. Not only did NACA reference the lack of rudder authority at low speeds and high angles of attack, they also referenced pitch moments from side slips being rapid and hard to control. The P-47, especially at low speeds, could be a handful, and that counts against it in terms of maneuverability. Note that you shouldn't be dogfighting at low speed in the P-47, as we'll see later. It's generally a bad idea, but this issue makes it a bit worse. I'll add in that this problem is magnified anytime you increase power in an airplane without increasing the size of the control surfaces, and that happened a lot in World War II fighters, not just the P-47. Often the limitations of control authority is what prevents the designers from just putting more and more powerful engines on airplanes. I'm sure the late war P-47s were quite a handful at low speeds when putting out 2,600 or 2,800 horsepower. Back to level turns. So in a hard left turn, P-factor actually reduces the amount of rudder needed, but in a right turn it needs more and thus has more drag. In a climbing or descending turn, the amount varies, so that's the second point here. Although we'll be using level turns for measurement and comparison, There are some minor differences between left and right turns with a vertical component, and those have to do with the energy lost or gained by going up or downhill, as well as the differences in control surface deflection. Next, we need to cover the maximum sustained turn performance, and this one is a bit tricky. There is a USAAF report that shows the turn radius for the P-47 during a 4G turn to be 990 feet. But the report also makes it clear that this isn't necessarily a constant altitude turn. The report doesn't give a lot of detail, but says the 47 was at a weight of 13,000 pounds. It's interesting, if you graph the 47 at sea level, I did that here with the blue line, we get about the same number. An electronic calculator shows 995 feet. However, there's a problem. This report says they did the comparison at 10,000 feet. If we correct for true airspeed at 10,000 feet, even using 115 mile per hour stall speed, we get 1,241 feet. That's a lot more than 990. Two possibilities here. Either the person doing the calculations forgot to compensate for the increase in true airspeed at 10,000 feet, thus used their 240 mile per hour speed for the calculation instead of the true airspeed of 279, or their P-47 had a stall speed at that weight of 103 miles per hour. I think the former is much more likely. It's an easy mistake to make. Normally, rather than calculate sustained turns, various agencies would just take two planes they wanted to compare and have them chase each other in circles to see which one would sustain a higher turn rate and a lower radius. We'll take a look at one such report with the 47 a bit later. First, we're going to calculate maximum sustained turn performance. There are four forces acting on the plane in flight. They are lift, thrust, drag, and weight. Let's talk about lift for a moment. Lift has to equal weight. If the plane weighs 10,000 pounds, it will need 10,000 pounds of lift. Actually, to be more accurate, since the tail of most planes, and all the planes we're talking about right now, produce downforce, the wings actually create an amount of lift greater than the weight of the airplane. They need to generate an amount of lift equal to the weight of the airplane plus the tail downforce. This is why an aft center of gravity makes the plane a little bit faster. It reduces the required tail downforce. Now, in terms of turn performance, I see a lot of people referencing wing loading. Wing loading is the total weight divided by the wing area. The principle I see being referenced all the time is that wing loading, or at least lower wing loading airplanes, will automatically outturn higher wing loading airplanes. In fact, I'm quite sure that several flight sims rank turn performance entirely on wing loading, and that's absolutely wrong. As you can see in item 1 here, while wing area is a factor in determining how much lift a wing can generate, the maximum coefficient of lift is also a factor, and that's affected by wing design. Does anyone really think that all of the wing designs here are going to produce the same amount of lift for a given amount of area? Of course not. Even at equal wing loading, every one of these wings will have different turn performance. Thankfully, we don't need to figure out wing performance because aircraft stall speed already gives us the information we need. As it says here, aircraft stall speed is the one common denominator of aerodynamic turning performance. That makes sense. We already know the maximum turn performance is only a question of speed and load factor. The stall speed determines the aerodynamic limit for the load factor at any given speed. Regardless of wing design or wing loading, a plane with a 100 mile per hour stall speed has a limit of 4 Gs at 200 miles per hour. You could have a plane with a lower wing loading that stalls at 110, and it could only pull 3.3 Gs at that point before getting into an accelerated stall. Now, this doesn't say, or I'm not saying that wing area or wing loading doesn't matter for turn performance. It does, with all other factors equal or fixed. You could even say that wing loading will be the key factor. However, just looking at stall speed takes that into account. Regardless of the wing loading, a plane's maximum turn rate and radius are entirely a function of load factor and airspeed. The aerodynamic limit for load factor is simply the square of the load factor multiplied by the stall speed. Wing area or wing loading are not in that equation. So let's think about our Thunderbolt. What's to stop it from sustaining a 4G turn? We know that the wing will support that at a speed of 240 miles per hour or more. The pilot can take it, the plane can certainly handle it. So why can't we just sustain a 4G turn at constant altitude? For that matter, why not 5 or 6 Gs? The problem is the tremendous increase in drag. If you don't already know what induced drag is, please watch the videos linked in the description for a full understanding. The short version is that it's drag caused by the rearward component of lift. As we bank the airplane, we need to pull back on the stick and increase the G load to hold altitude. That increases lift and thus induce drag. The amount of excess power we have will determine how many Gs we can hold. That's laid out for us in this paragraph from Aerodynamics for Naval Aviators. To figure all this out, we have to look at the Thunderbolt's power required versus power available data, and that means creating a drag chart. I have a good explanation of how to do that in another video, and that's also linked in the description. But today, we're going to use a slightly different method because we have what I think is some pretty good data to work from. For most airplanes, we simply don't have this information, but for the P-47B model, we do. Anyway, we have a power required versus power available chart for the 47B. It's a 1943 document from the U.S. Army Air Force's Material Command. And what's important here is that it gives their calculation on propeller efficiencies, and that's going to be very helpful. Let's take a look at the solid line at the bottom, which gives us power required at sea level. The speed for minimum power required is 135 miles per hour true airspeed, which is also calibrated airspeed under these conditions. They even give us the weight, which is 12,565 pounds, so that's what we'll use for our sustained turn numbers, or actually 12,500 even to make the math easier. We know from Aerodynamics for Naval Aviators that the speed for minimum power required is normally 76% of the minimum drag speed. That means our minimum drag speed here is 178 miles per hour at this weight. This is an important speed to know for figuring out drag values. It's often a difficult speed to figure out. In many cases, I have to take a best guess. For example, no P-47 manual gives a clear example of best glide speed. There is one reference in the 47 November manual that mentions keeping your speed above 150. If we correct the 178 mile per hour speed for a minimum weight P-47, meaning it's out of fuel, we get about 160 miles per hour. Does the 178 mile per hour minimum drag speed jive with other aircraft that are comparable, for which we do have numbers? Yes, I think so. The F-4U Corsair, as an example, heavily loaded, so it's about the same weight here, has a best climb speed of 130 knots, which is 150 miles per hour. Its best glide speed is published. It's 140 knots, or 161 miles per hour, so its best climb is about 93% of its best glide. The P-47's best climb is 165, which is 92.6% of its best glide. So by all the indications I can find, that 178 mile per hour number that we're going to use is solid. Now, we have what we need to create a decent drag chart for the P-47. So let's take a look at the finished chart here, and I'll explain how I came up with this. Not only will this allow us to determine the P-47's sustained turn performance, it will serve as a basic review of aerodynamics. We're going to compare the sustained turn performance of the P-47B to the 109F, which means we will also need a 109F drag chart. I happened to make one in a previous video. However, some clever viewers have pointed out that I probably used the wrong speed for best glide on that chart, and I agree, so I'm going to take this opportunity to fix it. The problem with the previous chart was that I used a published best glide speed from an English translation of a Finnish 109 manual, which was itself probably translated from German, and I think the meaning of, quote, best glide, unquote, was lost somewhere in a translation. I suspect the original German manual, they didn't mean it was the maximum forward travel for a given amount of altitude lost. I think they probably meant best engine out speed when you're ditching or something like that. I really don't know. As you'll see, the math in this type of operation is rock solid. The problems come from choosing the input data. So here's the new 109 chart. It has all the drag and power data we could ever need, and I think it's as accurate as possible. But let me show you the actual numbers here to understand how this is done. We start with one number, the top speed of the aircraft at sea level. Turns out the 109F was probably the worst 109 model for me to choose for this because there's relatively little data on it out there, and the data that is there varies quite a bit. I found that 325 miles per hour or 523 kph in an original German test is what they stated, so I'm going to go with that number. Next, we look at how much power it needs to reach that speed. From the same German test, we find it had about 1,150 horsepower. Now that's converted to US horsepower. There is no original source data for the 109's propeller efficiency that I can find. We know that the peak number for the P-47's prop was 85%. Horner's drag study of the 109G puts its prop efficiency at 85%. He was really just taking an educated guess there. But that number is in harmony with propeller numbers from Aerodynamics for Naval Aviators, so although I don't have anything specific for the 109, I'm good with 85%. Now, 0.85 times 1150, remember that's the horsepower, is 978. Then we add in 80 horsepower for exhaust thrust, and we have 1058. Now we get total drag by multiplying the total power required, 1058, by 374, and then divide that by our speed in miles per hour, and we get 1218. Note we use 374 miles per hour because that's the speed in miles per hour where 1 horsepower required equals 1 pound of drag. If we were using kph, it would be 602, and in knots, 325, which is what's used in the book. Then we divide that by our speed, which happens to be 325. Just a coincidence that that's the same as the point in knots, where 1 horsepower equals 1 pound of drag. Now, we need one more number, and that's the speed for the maximum lift over drag. Maximum lift over drag also coincides with best glide speed. Those two things are the same speed. It's simply not published anywhere for the 109F. We do have the best climb speed, which is 270 kph or 168 miles per hour. And looking at data from other World War II fighters shows that the maximum lift over drag is usually pretty close to the speed for best climb. In the case of the Corsair and P-47, best climb is about 93% of best glide. Many sleeker planes have it equal to or slightly lower than the best climb speed. For example, the P-40 and Spitfire Mark II have best climb speeds that are about equal. So I'm taking the best climb speed for the max L over D. It's probably not exact, but it's close enough. A shift of 10 miles per hour either way doesn't make that big of a difference. So now we have our 4 key numbers circled in red: the top speed at sea level, the maximum power that it takes to reach that speed, the total drag at that speed, and the speed for max L over D. From here, everything is an easy mathematical relationship, and filling in the chart really isn't too bad. We'll start with the parasite and induced drag numbers. Parasite drag varies as the square of the speed, and induced drag varies inversely as the square of the speed. We know that the numbers will be equal, in this case, at 168 miles per hour. In this case, they're 1 pound of drag different, but that's only due to rounding. Now, I started by assuming that parasite drag would be about 95% of the total drag. After a little trial and error, I found the numbers that work here are 1,137 for parasite drag and 81 for induced drag. Let's see how that works. 325 miles per hour is 1.935 times higher than 168. Remember, we're dealing with the square of the speed and everything here. So we square that number, 1.935, and we get 3.74. Again, I'm rounding, and that's why we had the slight difference at 168 miles per hour. Now, 3.74 times 81 gives us 303 pounds of induced drag at 168 miles an hour. To get parasite drag at that speed, we divide 1137 by 3.74, we get 304. The rest of the drag numbers are very easy. 325 miles per hour is 3.25 times more than 100 miles per hour. So square 3.25, multiply that by 81, and you get 856. Then just work through the chart. Divide 1137 by the same number, you get 108. Then you work through the chart. Square 1.25, multiply that by 108, you get 169. Just keep doing that and following that process, and pretty soon you have all of the drag numbers filled in for parasite and induced drag. To get total drag, you just add the parasite and induced drag numbers together. Now, let's move on to power. Back to the formula from the book. Let's do parasite power required at 100 miles per hour. We multiply the parasite drag of 108 by the speed of 100 and divide by 374, and we get 29. We can fill in the entire chart this way. Then just keep doing that and add the numbers together to get total power required. There's another way to do the math for power required. In fact, in a previous version of this video, someone was really bent out of shape that I didn't mention this. Some of you math guys get a little crazy about stuff. But anyhow, I'll mention it now. Notice that parasite power required varies as the cube of the speed. That means it's 27 times higher at 300 miles per hour than at 100 miles per hour, because 3 cubed is 27. Note that it's very slightly off here, again, due to rounding. When you cube stuff, if you don't go out to a bunch of decimal points, rounding errors really start to add up. Induced power required is another matter. It simply varies inversely with speed. Thus, induced power required at 150 miles per hour is half that of 100 miles per hour. To finish out the chart, we simply plug in the propeller efficiencies and exhaust thrust. I use the propeller efficiency numbers from the P-47. So, again, here is the entire chart. While the math is 100% sound, the chart is not perfect due to the educated guesses I had to make regarding the speed for max L over D, top speed, prop efficiency, but I think it's really as close as anyone can get with the data that's out there. Creating the drag chart for the 47 was a bit easier. Although there's more information for it, again, results vary a bit. I went with the test that showed a maximum speed at sea level with a 2,000 horsepower engine of top speed there of 320 miles per hour, and went with the 85% prop efficiency and 178 mile per hour best glide speed. From there, I made the power chart. In order to verify that we're at least in the ballpark, we can pull up cruise performance charts and see what speeds it gives for certain power settings at sea level. Now, the factory chart is for a range from 14,200 pounds down to 12,000 pounds, so the speed numbers have to be for the higher end of that range, otherwise people would run out of fuel. Our data is for the lower end, around 12,500 pounds. So let's put the numbers in, again accounting for prop efficiency, and see where we are. The numbers in the flight manual are a bit slower than ours, but our plane is lighter, so I think we're okay here. The top speeds are also pretty darn close to the test results. 2,000 horsepower, which is 1,700 after the prop losses, give us about 320 miles per hour. And 2,600, which is effectively 2,210, gives us about 350. Again, the math is correct, but math formulas are only as good as the numbers you start with, and with World War II planes, those numbers are a bit inconsistent. Now, sustained turn performance is limited by the difference between power available and power required. By definition, our best rate of climb speed is the speed at which there is the greatest difference between power available and power required. For the P-47, that's around 165 to 175 miles per hour. If we look at the numbers from our chart here, we see that we have 1,581 excess horsepower to deal with, the extra induced drag from our increasing G-load. So figuring out our maximum sustained G limit is pretty easy from here. We know that induced drag increases as the square of the load factor. Thus, at 2 Gs, our induced drag goes up by a factor of 4. As an example, let's take a look at our power requirements. As you can see, at 200 miles per hour, our power requirement for induced drag is 174 horsepower. During a 2G turn, that will be 4 times higher, so 696 horsepower. The parasite drag won't change much due to G load, so we add that 696 to 729, and we find that in a 2G turn, our total drag requires 1,425 horsepower. That's a lot less than the 2210 we have available. So sustaining a 2G turn at 250 miles per hour won't be a problem. In fact, we'll be able to enter a pretty good climb while sustaining a 2G turn at 250 miles per hour because we have excess power beyond what we need for the increase in induced drag by itself. Now, I graphed this out, and here is the chart. Let's talk about the yellow line first. It's pretty easy. It represents the maximum G load the plane can take before it stalls at any given speed. I used 7 Gs as the upper limit. This is limited by the wing, and as we discussed before, it's determined by the stall speed of the aircraft. Remember, I used a 120 mile per hour stall speed for this chart. It's absolutely debatable that a 115 mile per hour speed would better represent a dogfighting P-47, and it's even possible to have a P-47 with a 110 mile per hour stall speed when it's low on fuel and ammo. I went with 120 because I feel it represents the condition of the P-47 when a pilot first sees a 109 and drops his external tanks to do battle. The blue line is for a 2,000 horsepower P-47, like a B or C model, and the orange line is for a 2,600 horsepower model, like a late Model D, like a D-28. Keep in mind these are both at the same weight. With equal fuel, the early plane would be a bit lighter. Now, let's take a look at the P-47B versus 109F. The 109F outturns the P-47B under all conditions at sea level. Sea level is generally a bad place for the P-47. Notice that the 109 can pull a higher maximum G load at any airspeed. It can pull 7 Gs all the way down to 240 miles per hour, where the P-47 is limited to about 4 Gs. Sustained numbers get a little better for the 47, but it's still not going to win this as a sustained turn fight. Keep in mind the G limit is going to be lower. It's going to be the lower of the two, the sustained limit or the limit that the wing can handle. So at speeds below 175 miles per hour, it's quite bad for the P-47 because its wing starts to limit its turn rate in terms of both sustained and maximum rates. In other words, at 150 miles per hour, it's limited to about 1.5 Gs, even though it has some excess power there. In that case, the excess power could be used to climb while in the turn, but not to increase the turn rate. Now let's see what happens when up high. The picture changes quite a bit. The 109F's top speed up here is only 225 miles per hour indicated. Of course, its true speed is quite a bit higher. But that means that at this speed, it can't sustain any turn at all. Its power has fallen off, and it's using every bit just to fly in a straight line. At this speed, the P-47 has enough excess power to sustain a 1.7 G turn. This should explain why it's important to understand the effects of altitude on power and the effect on maneuverability. Down low, the 109F easily outturns the P-47B, but up high, it's the other way around. As I've mentioned, these numbers are not perfect due to a lack of perfect input data, but the overall picture is accurate. At least I think so. And what's important here are the principles involved and the overall big picture. which is that the 47 can maneuver pretty well at high altitudes where it's designed to fight. Of course, there are later 109s we could use for comparison, but when compared to their contemporary versions of 47s, the big picture looks about the same. The 109 wins down low but loses up high. This is true with an early G model 109 versus a D10, or a later G model versus a D28. Now, we know how to calculate the maximum sustained G load for a turn, but we haven't talked about the effect of the speed. At a given G load, a higher speed means a wider turn, but often the higher speed often allows for a higher G load, so these two factors cancel each other out to a degree. To graph this effect, we'll use the Navy chart. I know it's hard to read, but take a look at the red circle. That's the point showing the minimum sustained turn radius for a 2,000 horsepower 47 at sea level at 150 miles per hour, 175 miles per hour, and 200 miles per hour. Note how they are very close. That's because at 200 miles per hour, we can pull G loads high enough to largely offset the extra speed. As we speed up, the turns get wider. The red line that's just touching the right side of that circle is for 225 miles per hour. So you can see this turn really starts to widen between 200 and 225. And as you can see, the turn radius there is about 300 feet wider in that case. Now the next line to the right is 250 miles per hour. And you can see the sustained turn radius at that speed is much larger than it was at 200. The purple line to the far right is for 125 miles per hour, and so at that speed the turn radius is huge because we can't pull high enough G's to do much of a turn. So clearly there's an optimal range, and it's 150 to 200 miles per hour for this airplane. So what speed will give the absolute minimum sustained turn radius? Frankly, I can't draw lines thin enough to find the exact speed on this chart, but using an electronic calculator, I found in this case that it's about 170 miles per hour. Specifically, at 165 miles per hour, I got 1,099 feet. At 170 miles per hour, 10 feet less, 1,089, that was the minimum. And at 5 miles an hour more, 175 miles an hour, 1,094, so 5 feet more. So we're talking about a range of, a very small range between 165 and 175, and 170 is mathematically optimal. Now, it's no coincidence that 170 miles per hour, which is 275 kph, is about equal to the best climb speed for this airplane. In fact, that might be exactly the best climb speed for this weight. We don't know because we don't have published climb speeds for the various weights of the plane, or any other World War II fighter I know of. Let's move into the jet age for a moment and take a look at the F-86 Sabre. The pilot's manual for this airplane has a strongly worded statements about best climb speed. It says that the recommended speed for a minimum radius turn is the best climb speed. It also points out that in actual practice you may need to slow below this speed. The section on turn radius control also cautions against dropping below best climb speed. As a point of interest, they also have a diagram showing that failing to close the speed brakes when you reach best climb speed will cause more problems than it will solve. In short, I'm confident that best rate of climb speed is the best speed for a minimum radius sustained turn, or at least darn close. If anyone knows of a source saying this either way, please post a link in the comments. In any case, it seems to work out mathematically in the cases that I've looked at. I should also distinguish between a minimum radius turn and a maximum rate turn. These are not the same thing. It's quite possible to have one plane with a tighter turn radius find itself fighting a plane with a faster turn rate. This gets into the dilemma of a 1 versus 2 circle fight. If your plane turns tighter, then you want a 1 circle fight. If your plane turns faster, you want a 2 circle fight. This would take a long time to explain, but I've linked a video in the description that explains this beautifully. It's a good channel for graphically depicting and demonstrating air combat maneuvers. Now, I think we beat turn performance to death. The overall takeaway should be that at low altitude, the 47's turn performance isn't stellar, but it's generally competitive. Up high, the 47's turn performance is actually quite good. As compared with most of the German fighters, the higher the fight, the better it is for the 47. The only real exception to this would be the TA-152. We need to take a look at roll rate. You would think this one would be easy. Look up the rate, see where the 47 fits in, but that's not the case. For example, in this test, they give roll rates, but the rates are at 400 miles per hour indicated and with 50 pounds of force on the stick. Of course, in this case, the P-38 will have the best roll rate. It has powered ailerons, so that 50 pounds of stick force means maximum travel available for the ailerons. The P-51 is one of the faster rolling airplanes, but again, this is with 50 pounds of stick force. What if both pilots put in 60 pounds? What about full travel at 250 miles per hour? I'm afraid this report just doesn't give us a lot of data. This British report here shows that the P-47's roll rate is considerably better than the Mustang and puts the two airplanes about equal in rate of turn. In this example, they say that at low altitudes, the 47 roll rate is about equal to the Spitfire, perhaps a little better at high altitudes, and it's reported as superior to the Typhoon in this regard. Robert S. Johnson said, quote, "The Jug could outroll any plane in the air bar none," unquote. I don't doubt for a second that he means that, and it might very well be true. However, Robert S. Johnson was he was a physically strong guy. Before he was the top-scoring U.S. ace of the European theater, he had a very physical life. He was a boxer, wrestler, football player, and although he wasn't big, it could be that he was strong enough to generate enough stick force so that his P-47 would outroll anything in the sky. So, it's time to dig into the NACA library to see if they can help us with this. And if you've been watching this channel for a while, you knew this was coming. By the way, NACA has done tons of stuff to help figure out aircraft turning performance. It's just that for this video I decided to use Aerodynamics for Naval Aviators because it's all in one book and it explains things, in my view, a little bit better because of its target audience. Most of the NACA reports were written for scientists and not pilots. Anyway, after the war, NACA came out with this report. It's Report 868, titled Summary of Lateral Control Research. Lateral control means roll control. Right away, we run into a term that almost nobody is familiar with, which is wingtip helix angle, referred to as PB over 2B. I had no idea what this was. So, back to Aerodynamics for Naval Aviators for an explanation of just what the heck they're talking about. The helical angle they are talking about is the angle between the flight path of the wingtip and the forward direction of the airplane's travel. I could not find a good picture to explain this, so I turned this spin picture on its side. Imagine that the yellow line is the helical path of the right wingtip during a roll to the right. The angle between that path and the path of the airplane, shown by the silver bar, is the helical angle, which again they like to call PB over 2B. In this test, NACA found, as we discussed in part 2 of this series, that the P-47B's ailerons start to lose effectiveness at very high speeds due to wing twist and actually reverse at 545 miles per hour. That's what limits the dive speed. This was corrected, or at least reduced, on the P-47 November model, which is why it can reach a dive speed of 565 miles per hour at low altitudes. The report gives us a chart with helical angles, but thankfully they also give one with roll rate in degrees per second, so let's focus on that. From this chart we learn several things. First of all, at all speeds above 220 miles per hour indicated, the FW-190 has the fastest roll rate of all planes, and by a large margin, until it reaches 360 miles per hour, which it won't normally do unless it's in a dive. Remember, it can go over 400 miles per hour in level flight in terms of true airspeed, but not indicated. At very low airspeeds, the clipped-wing Spitfire is the best, and it's one of the best at almost all speeds. Of course, part of the reason they clipped the wings on the Spitfire was to get the faster roll rate. The other reason was to reduce parasite drag and thus overall drag at high indicated airspeeds, at the expense of an increase in induced drag and thus overall drag at low speeds. That's a story for another time. I really do need to get around to making a Spitfire video. Let me add in some color here with my paint skills to help out a bit. The Thunderbolt line is red, P-51B blue, Spitfire normal wing. The official term for the Spitfire wings are clipped and full span. Let me clarify that. I may have misspoken. The Thunderbolt line is red, the P-51B is green, and the Spitfire normal wing is blue. Now, on this chart, below about 280 miles per hour, the Spitfire will outroll the P-47. Above that, the 47 will outroll the Spitfire. The P-51B is a little behind the Thunderbolt until about 230 miles an hour, and then it's better. As it gets ahead of the Spitfire at about 285 miles per hour. At very high speeds, the P-51B is the fastest rolling plane here. So that's the closest thing to an official answer I have on roll rates. It's clear that with 50 pounds of stick force, the P-47B's roll rates are typical of the better World War II fighters. However, I can't say what would happen at 60 pounds of stick force. It's also clear that the 47's roll rate is hampered by wing flex, and we know that they fixed that for the November models, but I can't say if they fixed it or improved it for the Ds or maybe later D models. In short, I don't have a 100% solid answer for you here. What I do think we can conclude without much question is that at most airspeeds, the 190 was the fastest rolling of these fighters. It's so far ahead with 50 pounds of stick force that I just don't think anything else would catch up even under other conditions. I need to talk very briefly about climb. We covered maximum climb rate in a previous episode, but there are other categories of climb that matter. First, we have maximum angle of climb. The ability to climb steeply was of value, and it was a tactic often used by the Bf-109Es early in the war. It was also used by Japanese Zeros against the U.S. Navy until the advent of the Hellcat and Corsair, and also to an extent when they had to fight P-38s. The idea is to climb so steeply that your opponent stalls out trying to follow you. Of course, your opponent has to be low enough on energy in the first place for this to work, otherwise he will be able to zoom climb and get his sights on you for at least a short time. The best angle of climb speed is always lower than the best rate of climb speed. It's not published for the P-47, but my guess is it's around 145, maybe 150 miles an hour. In the high altitude turns we talked about earlier, that would be a situation where the P-47 could use this. At low speeds, the 109 might be able to follow the turn rate and radius under some conditions. But since the 47 can enter a climb and the 109 can't without either shallowing the turn or stalling, the 47 can use angle of climb to its advantage when it's at high altitudes. Alternatively, at high speeds, a plane with a power and speed advantage can create this angle as well. The basic idea is that any time at a given speed you can climb at a steeper angle than your enemy, you can create some problems for him. Over on the iFly Central channel, which I subscribe to, Central does exactly this in one of his videos, this one here. In this case, he's flying a 190 against a Yak, and it's at low altitude, but the principle is the same. I've put a link in the description. It's really a perfect explanation of how to use excess power in a turn to get a steep climb angle and end up with an energy advantage, which can then be used to turn the tables on a more maneuverable airplane. This video does a better job of describing this through actions than I can do through words. Another type of climb is the zoom climb. This is when an airplane builds up speed, sometimes in level flight, but ideally in a dive because you get more speed that way. That speed is then used as energy to climb very rapidly for a short period of time, which means until the airspeed drops to the best rate of climb speed. The Thunderbolt has a very high maximum dive speed and it's heavy, so there's a lot of potential energy here, thus its zoom climb ability is very good. The last type of climb I want to cover is the high speed climb. This is when a plane climbs at a low rate but a high speed. This enables a fast but slow climbing airplane like the Thunderbolt to gain an altitude advantage on a pursuing aircraft. It works like this. Say you're in your Thunderbolt, and at your present altitude, whatever it is, you can reach 400 miles per hour. True airspeed. You're being pursued by a 109 just outside of gun range, and he can only reach 370 miles an hour true. Now, you could continue to run away, but you have a war to win. So instead, you leave the engine at full power and pull back on the stick until you match speeds with your pursuer. Remember, you can do that because you're out of gun range, so you don't need to pull any more distance on him. Now, you're both going 370 miles an hour, but you are climbing and he can't at that speed. If he decides to climb, he will have to slow down and will fall farther behind. He either has to give up the chase or accept that when you turn around, you will have the advantage. Now, let's move on. It's time to look at some gun camera footage, so children or people easily offended, stop the video now. All of these scenes are from an FW-190, and I am going somewhere with this. All I need you to notice at the moment is that when the FW-190 fires, the camera does not shake. In fact, it appears that the gunfire has no real effect on the camera at all. This matters because in a few minutes we'll be watching gun camera footage of an FW-190 in a serious, sustained turn fight with a P-47. There isn't a lot of Luftwaffe gun camera footage out there, but the overall point is that you can see tracers, and sometimes, as on this B-17, flashes when the target is taking hits, but no camera shake. The typical 190 gun camera was located here. It was a 16mm movie camera, 15 meters worth of film, that's about 50 feet. The camera is triggered when the fuselage or inboard wing guns fire, or by pressing a camera trigger on the throttle. When triggered, it runs for about 45 seconds, and that 50 feet of film lasts about 4 runs. The 190 is known for having a particularly aggressive accelerated stall. That's a stall at a relatively high speed during a turn due to the increased load factor. In this video we're about to watch, I think we can see this happen several times. Both planes are in a maximum performance turn, and it's a pretty long fight because the planes have similar turn performance at this altitude, which I judge to be about 3,000 feet. The 190 pilot is very good at controlling his plane while it enters an accelerated stall, and I think he pulls into it on purpose on several occasions in order to try to pull the 47 into his sights just long enough to get a burst in. Of course, in cases when that doesn't work, it allows the 47 to gain some ground, and it takes a lot of time for the 190 to get it back. Keep in mind there's a lot of things that we don't see here, like the times before and after and between the footage. It says approach curve battle. Hey, that's just what we need. Start distance 300 meters, leaving 150 meters. Right at the start, we've got some shaking from the 190's accelerated stall, and that allows the 47 to gain some ground, but the 190 starts to reel the 47 back in before, again, the accelerated stall causes it to lose ground to the 47. I think there's a cut in the film around here, can't be 100% sure. Once again, the 190 is pulling the 47 in, but accelerated stall and just can't quite get the shot, although it looks like he almost got it that time. Both pilots appear to be very skilled, and both planes are pretty evenly matched here at an altitude which I judge to be about 3,000 feet. The 190 pilot's very good at riding the edge of that accelerated stall. You'll see him do it again here. He's trying to pull the 47 in, and there's the accelerated stall. He just couldn't quite get the shot, although that one was really close. Now this time, you'll notice, he's pulling in very, very slowly, still got it. He'll try again here and pull in very, very slowly, trying to not get the accelerated stall, or when he does get it, get some shots in. So right there, he gets some shots in right as he gets the accelerated stall and hits Good hits into the wing root. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, great job. We covered a lot of stuff. I don't think anyone else has made a video on calculating sustained turn performance, probably because there's so much material to go over. But you should now have some idea about induced drag and parasite drag, how they vary with speed, and you should know how induced drag varies with load factor. That's important. And you probably have a decent understanding of load factor and how it interacts with these things to determine turn radius, and that in a steady coordinated turn, load factor is going to be related to bank angle. It's important to understand the principles here. Due to variations in the input data, we could debate turn radius for World War II fighters until the cows come home, but if you don't understand the principles, you're not really understanding the debate at all. I'm sure that turn radius charts we came up with are solidly in the ballpark, not perfect but close, and good enough to show valid comparisons between the planes. Have a great day, and I hope to see you next time. Goodbye.